Good evening. My name is Nancy Keegan-Smith, and as Flair Vice President, I want to welcome you to tonight's program in honor of National Preservation Month and done in partnership with our newest lifetime institutional member, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, and their Chief Preservation Officer, Catherine Malone France. Before we get to our special program, I would like to thank our partner, American University School of Public Affairs, and our Flair Institutional Lifetime members, Rider University, the White House Historical Association, Massachusetts Historical Society, the Gerald R. Ford Presidential Center, the National First Ladies Library, the Center for Presidential History of Southern Methodist University, the George W. Bush Institute, and the Dole Institute of Politics, along with our newest, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Our program tonight should be fascinating and focuses on the White House restoration efforts of three First Ladies, Jackie Kennedy, Lady Bird Johnson, and Pat Nixon, and their efforts to make White House restoration a more permanent part of the White House structure. And their efforts are reflective of their personalities. I will now happily turn over the program to Catherine Malone France, the Chief Preservation Officer for the National Trust for Historic Preservation. Catherine?
Movement and the National Trust owe tremendous debts to many First Ladies who have been champions of historic preservation. And for that reason, at the National Trust, we are so honored to support the important work of Flair. Thanks especially to Anita McBride and Nancy Keegan-Smith for their leadership of Flair and for the invitation to be a part of this program tonight. I'm especially pleased to be here today to talk about the incredibly important role that First Ladies have played in historic preservation, particularly in the preservation of the White House during May, which, as Nancy noted, has been celebrated around the country as National Preservation Month since 1973. Also, at the National Trust, we are in the midst of our Where Women Made History campaign to highlight and preserve the places where women made important contributions to our country, including the fact that the preservation movement itself was largely built and led by women over the 19th and the 20th centuries. As a part of that, many First Ladies have been important champions of preservation. I'm just beginning a research project on the important and intertwined preservation legacies of Secretary Clinton, Mrs. Bush, and Mrs. Obama. Today, though, our panel will focus on the preservation work of three other First Ladies, Mrs. Kennedy, Mrs. Johnson, and Mrs. Nixon, particularly in the preservation of the White House. But before we do that, I think it's important to briefly acknowledge a few of their broader contributions to preservation as well. In addition to Mrs. Kennedy's preservation work at the White House and sharing its history with the American public, she created the White House Historical Association, and she almost single-handedly preserved the cultural landscape of Lafayette Square, sparing it from being entombed by new federal buildings that would have radically altered its historic character. In 1966, when President Johnson sent the final version of the National Historic Preservation Act to Congress, it was accompanied by a handwritten note from him that stated simply, "Lady Bird wants it." And on May the 8th, 1973, 50 years ago, First Lady Patricia Nixon read the first presidential proclamation of National Preservation Month at the storied Decatur House in Washington, D.C., then the headquarters of the National Trust. She said to the crowd assembled, "As the pace of change accelerates in the world around us, Americans more than ever need a lively awareness of our roots and origins in the past, on which to base our sense of identity in the present, and our directions for the future. To share more about these three First Ladies as preservationists, we are appropriately joined by three brilliant women as our presenters today. Dr. Jody Natale is a founding board member of FLAIR and the author of Jacqueline Kennedy and the Architecture of First Lady Diplomacy. Nancy Keegan-Smith is the vice president and a founding board member of FLAIR and the author of numerous publications on Lady Bird Johnson. And Dr. Mary C. Brennan is the author of Pat Nixon, Embattled First Lady, and she is the dean of the College of Liberal Arts at Texas State University. With that, I'll turn it over to Jody, but we'll all be back for a Q&A after the presentations. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Catherine. I am so excited to be able to talk about a couple of my favorite topics: preservation, design, redecoration, decoration, restoration, and First Ladies. And it's really my pleasure to talk about my favorite First Lady today, and that is Jacqueline Kennedy. So if we could have the first slide, yes. And my argument today is going to be that Jacqueline Kennedy's White House restoration that ran from 1961 to 1963 really provided a blueprint for preservation for First Ladies to come. And in 1967, when the then president of the National Trust for Historic Preservation, Richard Moe, interviewed with public historian Carl Anthony, he said, Jacqueline Kennedy gave voice and visibility to the historic preservation movement. With her position as First Lady, she provided moral authority to make a difference. And indeed, Jacqueline Kennedy was involved with restoration for much of her adult life after the success of the White House restoration. And as we heard from Catherine, Lafayette Square, and later then as a private citizen, the Grand Central Station in New York City as well. But today I'm going to talk about three topics. Next slide, please. Regarding Jacqueline Kennedy and White House preservation. So first I'll talk a little bit about the White House restoration itself, which she told Hugh Sidey in her interview for Life magazine in 1961, that really it was a matter of scholarship and not simply redecoration of the White House. We'll talk about the 1962 televised tour of the White House, where not only did the televised tour manage to increase White House visits by tourists, but it also elevated the status of the building itself to its iconic value as the center of American democracy. And then I'll talk briefly about the White House Historical Association, which was established in November of 1961 as the nonprofit arm of support to the public as part of the daily interaction to support the White House. Next slide, please. So there actually is a precedent for White House preservation by other First Ladies. We know that preservation is necessary given the wear and tear on the building, but the role of preservationist and White House manager actually falls on the First Lady, as we know from Robert Watson's typology on First Lady roles. And we do have many former First Ladies who have made different attempts to preserve and update the White House as appropriate, including, for example, Abigail Fillmore, who worked on the library, Carolyn Harrison, who actually designed East and West wings that were never built. And it wasn't until the 1902 Roosevelt restoration that Theodore Roosevelt had those wings built, while Edith Roosevelt worked on the family quarters and the state dining room. So it wasn't until the 1948 Truman structural renovation that Mrs. Kennedy actually had a solid foundation for her own scholarly approach to the interior of the building when it came time for her to choose her agenda as First Lady. Next slide, please. So what was her approach to restoration? Well, she had a loose working philosophy with many parts that interacted with each other. And some of the things that she was trying to achieve included the creation of a museum quality building that reflected the American presidency based on the creation of period rooms from the 18th and the 19th century. She wanted to reflect the history of the White House, particularly the presidents and the families who lived there, by doing so with these period rooms in the public spaces. She, of course, wanted authenticity, but based on her own personal preferences and some of her study and work in French design, she had authenticity to a certain degree by the time it was all said and done. Above all, she wanted excellence in quality so that the furnishings that they acquired, those that they restored, and other objects that were added to the White House collection had to be of the highest quality. She also relied on experts and research to create a formal plan for White House preservation. And this started right from the beginning when the curators from the Smithsonian sent over a working paper that talked to her about restoration, including her own research that she did through the Library of Congress and the employment of friends and volunteers who helped throughout the time that the project went on. And finally, she thought she would leave the Kennedy name with a lasting history, but little did she know that the assassination and her interview with Theodore White, when she called it Camelot, would probably overshadow most people's knowledge of her White House restoration work. But she knew right from the beginning this is what she had to do. And so what she did was to establish a variety of self-sustaining structures, starting with the White House Fine Arts Committee that was chaired by Henry DuPont, who had created the Winterthur Museum in Delaware. Of course, we mentioned the White House Historical Association, still in existence today and going stronger than ever. The first White House curator came on board during Mrs. Kennedy's agenda, and that was Lorraine Pierce, who'd been trained through the program established with the Winterthur and the University of Delaware. She was the one who persuaded some Congress people to adopt Public Law 87-286 to provide the permanent preservation of all the objects within the White House that heretofore had sometimes been sold, sometimes went missing, sometimes were in places who knows where. But the Smithsonian would then become, through this law, part of the place where things could be stored and not lost over time. She, of course, created the White House Guidebook, which included National Geographic photos as part of the education of the public and as a funding mechanism as well, where for $1 a piece, tourists could take that guidebook with them after a tour of the White House. Working with the Smithsonian in several different ways. She also worked with the National Park Service because the White House is now under the auspices of the National Park Service as the President's Park, a fact that a lot of people do not know today. Next slide. So within 3 years, there was very quick progress that was made. Within 1 year, the restoration was complete enough to offer the public the televised tour, which I'll talk about in just a moment. By June of 1962, the guidebook was available to the public as both a souvenir and an educational tool. And by the fall of 1963, much of the restoration was significantly complete. And I cannot emphasize how important this was in terms of the very quick time in which this restoration took place. And here you see the beautiful Red Room as one of the public spaces that turned out so gorgeously. And the quality of the restoration was superb, which really tended to then answer some of the questions and doubts that people had when this project first began, I think including by her own husband. Next slide, please. So the televised tour aired to over 80 million Americans on February 14th, 1962, on Valentine's Day. And the producer of that particular show was Perry Wolfe with CBS. And he said in a later publication, "A woman spoke for an hour and the White House once more became the central symbol of America." And Wolfe indicated that this was not only one of the very first documentaries produced on national television, but it was the first one narrated by a woman. And it was so successful that the show aired not only on CBS, but ABC, NBC, and subsequently on networks around the world. Next slide. So the result of this successful televised tour not only earned Mrs. Kennedy an honorary Emmy, it also elevated the ethos of the White House to the other great houses and palaces around the world, and in this case, as our symbol of democracy. Here you see a photograph taken from what was a black and white tour of the White House, where Mrs. Kennedy's in the state dining room with the host Charles Collingwood. And at the end of the program, JFK came on board and spoke to Mr. Collingwood for a moment. And he said, the restoration really makes the White House a stronger panorama of our great story, as both he and Mrs. Kennedy understood the value of the historical preservation that was being created through this project of Mrs. Kennedy. Next slide, please. So then in the White House Historical Association, which was established in 1961 as the support and a funding source for the restoration, really is designed to protect, preserve, and provide public access to the rich history of America's executive mansion. So not only do we have publications such as the guide, still going strong today, that you can buy, but the White House Historical Association provides conferences, seminars, and other forms of education, in addition to its staff working on a daily basis with the White House as questions arise and procedures need to be employed to keep the White House running in the way that it should. I would also recommend to everybody, if you would like to read the new edition of Designing Camelot by Abbott and Bachman, that's available to you through the White House Historical Association. Next slide, please. So what do we make of Mrs. Kennedy's restoration? Well, in 2004, I said that Mrs. Kennedy's greatest contribution to American history is the transformation of the White House itself to a museum quality building that represents an accurate portrayal of presidential life, including authentic artifacts and furniture representing some of our most important presidents. But today I would say that it's remained for subsequent First Ladies and the White House Historical Association to maintain her work and continue the ongoing preservation effort that is so important to America's symbol of democracy. Thank you.
Jody, that was an excellent presentation and so interesting. I do want to mention, and I'm sure Jody would agree with me, that John F. Kennedy and the Kennedy staff were not totally in favor of Mrs. Kennedy initially doing White House restoration because they thought it might be looked at as too luxury oriented, but then they did come on board. In looking at Mrs. Johnson's White House restoration efforts, this is the last slide. Can we please, go back to the first slide? Yes. The first slide. First slide is Mrs. Johnson, please. Stay. In looking at Mrs. Johnson's White House restoration efforts, we also learn about the relationship between Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Johnson and how the restoration of these two First Ladies reflect their personalities. We also learn about Lady Bird's substantive efforts that really have not been given that much credit. The tragic assassination changed so much, including Mrs. Kennedy's White House restoration efforts. Mrs. Johnson told me in an interview that I did with her in 1987 that her first efforts as First Lady were focused on making Mrs. Kennedy as comfortable and helping her in whatever way she could. She did not want in 1963 to pick projects. She wanted to help Mrs. Kennedy. However, slide 2, please. However, Mrs. Kennedy, in spite of the horror that had happened, still had the focus, the grace, and the composure to host the new First Lady, Mrs. Johnson, at a tea on November 26, 1963, to discuss, quote, housekeeping details. In the interview I did with Mrs. Johnson, she said Mrs. Kennedy was orderly, composed, and radiating her particular sort of aliveness and charm and warmth. In this meeting, Mrs. Johnson remembered that Mrs. Kennedy asked her to do something that was really unprecedented in terms of first ladies. She asked Mrs. Johnson to carry on and make permanent her White House restoration efforts. And amazingly, she had prepared a 7-page handwritten letter on a yellow notepad giving detailed guidance on the history of what she had done in the White House and advising Mrs. Johnson on her hope for continuing and making a more permanent structure for future White House restoration efforts. And by the way, that 7-page legal handwritten letter is at the Johnson Library. Mrs. Johnson said Mrs. Kennedy, quote, really wanted me to safeguard that and continue that. Her words fell on fertile ground because I cared deeply about it, although from a different viewpoint, because I wasn't formally trained in 18th century furniture, art, or anything like that. My main drive was to get American artists represented in the White House, and I did. Lady Bird lets Jackie know that the President Johnson planned to formally establish a committee for the preservation of the White House. And Jackie writes Mrs. Johnson from Hyannisport, again in her handwritten, in her handwriting in December of 1963. I am touched that you want to do this. Maybe I will be remembered as the person who started restoring the White House, but you will be remembered as the one who preserved it and made sure for all time that it was cared for. That was the moment I was always scared of. Would the next president's wife scrap the whole thing as she was sick to death of hearing about Jacqueline Kennedy? Or would she forget about me and ensure that the White House will always be cared for? Well, you have done that, and I thank you. Slide 3, please. President Johnson passed an executive order in March of 1964 providing the formal structure for future White House restorations by making the White House curator a permanent government position and establishing a committee for the preservation of the White House that still exists today. Slide 4, please. Mrs. Johnson felt, and these feelings are very similar to Mrs. Kennedy's, that the White House had 3 main purposes, which she kept in mind doing her restoration efforts. First, it belonged to all people of the United States, and it's a national museum. It really records the way of furnishings and memories of lives from everybody who lived there, from John and Abigail Adams on. Second, it is the place where the head of state extends hospitality to visiting heads of state and other visitors at ceremonial functions. And third, it is the home of the family day in and day out. Slide 5, please. On May 7th, 1964, Mrs. Johnson held the first committee meeting of the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, and she recorded in her diary, "This is the day I regarded as an emotional hurdle, something to tease my mental muscles for and to jump over successfully." She told me she was scared. And I was so surprised when she said that. I'll say it again. She told me she was scared because they belonged to a world that I didn't belong to. But I really felt I left there with some good friends. She wanted the group to focus on adding Americana to the White House and practical things, as Mrs. Johnson was, like replacing precious rugs with good copies and preserving those rugs. Of course, Mrs. Johnson loved to beautify the environment and was the environmental first lady. The White House grounds were no exception. One of her efforts was to complete Jackie Kennedy's restoration of the East Garden, making it a hedge-bordered retreat in the 18th century style. She decided to dedicate this garden to Jacqueline Kennedy, inviting her to the dedication, but Mrs. Kennedy was not ready to come back to the White House at that point. Instead, she sent her a letter in April of 1965. Thank you for dedicating the garden. I was more touched than I can possibly express to you by the way you did it, the things you said, and the people you asked to be there. You have been so understanding on my reluctance to come back to the White House. I appreciate all of that in the garden. When you first mentioned it, I never thought it should have been named for me. But as I see it now, a garden for a wife and little children, I think it grows more beautiful every year. It will always make people remember the side of President Kennedy, all his gentleness and love. Slide 8, please. Mrs. Johnson, and this isn't very well known, made a movie called The President's House in 1968. This movie never aired.
Friends.
In it, Mrs. Johnson.
One of the things that I am proud to leave.
In it, Mrs. Johnson focused on showing the family quarters and the White House, going from room to room and telling stories about the families who lived there. In the family living room, she talks about the American paintings acquired as part of her White House restoration efforts.
As a reminder of our time here is the addition to the White House permanent collection of paintings. Thomas Sully's portrait of Fanny Kimball is sheer romance, and I love it. This is our most recent acquisition for the permanent collection, Robert Henry's Gypsy Girl. The first painting acquired during our stay at the White House was Winslow Homer's Surf at Prout's Neck. I saved my favorite, the Mary Cassatt, for last. You can almost feel the love between the mother and those children. Look at that little girl. Is she wondering what the small child is going to mean to her life? It's such a dear painting. It seems to set the tone of the room. It's where the family shared so many personal and intimate moments, where we felt we were in the heart of the house, really at home.
Mrs. Johnson's last project was a gift to the White House, which was finished and dedicated on the last day, January 19th, 1969, the White House Children's Garden. So if we can go to the last slide, please. The White House Children's Garden was, Mrs. Johnson wrote a letter describing a garden that she had made that she wanted to leave for White House children and grandchildren of days to come. And you can see in that photo, Lucy and Linda bring their children, Patrick and Lucinda, to the dedication. And what is really funny is there was a little fountain in the children's garden. And this is January 19th, 1969. And Patrick falls right into the little pond, and Lucy has to run him up to the White House and dry him off. So Mrs. Johnson Riley observes that she will now be sure that a little fence is constructed around the pond. To the end, Mrs. Johnson's substantial efforts for White House restoration were true to her loves of Americana, the outdoors, and making the White House a beautiful and comfortable place for subsequent presidential families and the nation. And now I'm delighted to turn it over to Mary Brennan on Pat Nixon.
Thank you, Nancy. We have just heard two wonderful presentations focused on the first ladies you probably associated with preservation. And now here I am talking about Pat Nixon, and you are thinking there must be some mistake. After all, Plastic Pat, with her J.C. Penney taste, as one critic put it, could not possibly have contributed to anything as sophisticated as White House preservation. Aware of these assumptions about her, Nixon was reluctant to step into the preservation arena. Her dedication, however, to ordinary people, as opposed to what she called the big shots, led her into what I will argue is an altered version of preservation. For Nixon, any discussion of preservation has to include a concept of expansion, what we would call accessibility. In her view, the White House was the people's house, all of the people. Now, continuing this line of reasoning, though, meant that the White House should be a showplace. And because she was aware that she was not trained in art history or in preservation, she was very willing to turn to experts to help her accomplish this goal. In the end, she succeeded in both of her goals, accessibility and preservation, without most of the American public knowing anything about it. In this effort, as with many aspects of her life, Nixon's accomplishments were lost in the midst of her husband's career. And I want to point out that part of the reason that people had this view of Mrs. Nixon has to do with where she came from. Go to the next slide. Pat Nixon came from very humble beginnings. She worked all of her life. She lost her mother when she was 13, her father when she was 18. She put herself through college. She worked very hard. There's a picture of her driving a car. She drove someone across the country as a way of earning money. She worked in a laboratory. She was trained as a teacher. She put herself through school. When she got out of school and she was teaching, she eventually marries Dick Nixon. And she continues to work hard while he is off during the war. She works as she takes a government job. When he comes back from the war, next slide, they kind of enter their early married career. And these are years where they really are this middle class, working class couple. Even though he runs for office, they basically took all the money they had saved during the war to buy a house and they use it for his campaign. He is successful. He becomes the vice presidential candidate. But remember that part of the way that he is able to preserve his vice presidential campaign is by giving the Checkers speech. And as part of the Checkers speech, he talks about his wife and her plain cloth coat. So she's not someone who is used to grander taste. Now, she does travel during the vice presidential years. They are able to travel tremendously, something she'd always wanted to do. And she took in all of this new culture. She loved it. They came back. And in 1960, he lost the presidential race to John Kennedy. And they had a number of years there in between his political career. They moved to New York. And while in New York, there's one incident about their time in New York I want to tell you. And that is that Nixon gave her carte blanche to decorate their apartment. And she both had she wanted this to be an elegant place. And so she buys gold-plated traps for under the sink, but she also wanted it to be a home. So she made the curtains for the girls' rooms. She is someone who is very much both worlds. Now, in 1968, they get back to the White House. The next slide. And they move into the White House. And her first real impulse is to do something to turn this into a home. She did have some familiarity with the White House when she was second lady. She and Mamie Eisenhower got along very well. So she had been in the family quarters on a number of occasions. She and Mrs. Johnson had a good working relationship because they had worked together as well when Lyndon was the Senate Majority Leader and Pat was the second lady. So they worked very well as part of the Senate wives. They get there and they move to the White House, and Pat is determined she's going to make sure that this is a good family home. But she also gets in trouble gets in trouble a little bit almost immediately, because the day after the inauguration, they're hosting an event for campaign workers. And Pat tells everyone, you're all invited back. We're going to have our friends here instead of all the big shots. All of this was really about her idea that while the White House was for entertaining dignitaries, it was also very much the people's house. And when Pat talked about the people, she meant all the people, and especially the people who a lot of times were kind of left out of this equation. Go to the next slide. They moved there, and she realized that there were thousands of people in DC who had never visited the White House because they were working during the day and the White House tours were closed at night. So she set up tours in the evening and illuminated the White House at night so that people could see it. Go to the next slide. She also reintroduced a tradition that had existed earlier in the 20th century, and that was opening the gardens one weekend in the spring and one weekend in the fall. And here you have a picture of Pat and Dick leading the first tour through the Rose Garden in 1973. But again, the idea is that this should be everybody's home and people should feel comfortable there. And that is one of the things that you see in pictures whenever you see pictures about her time in the White House. If you go to the next slide. She was, for all her reputation as Plastic Pat, for people who knew her, people who interacted with her, they saw a warm and loving woman who was very open to everyone. So you have this is the diplomatic corps' children down in the bottom where she's hugging the child. This is the child of the muscular dystrophy child. This is, and then at the top is, you can't see this, but she was actually speaking to tour guides. One of the other things that she did was to realize, okay, people who are going on the tour who are hard of hearing or deaf, they're missing all of this information. So she arranged for special tour guides for the hard of hearing so that they would be able to enjoy all of this. She wanted to make sure that everybody, like the hard of hearing, were going to be able to participate. If you go to the next slide, she set up a special tour. And I'm not sure if you can see it or not, but the children in this picture have gloves on. That's because they're blind and sight impaired. And they were allowed to touch certain features in the White House that most people are not allowed to touch, because she knew that they would have to be able to see it with their hands. She also, when she got to the White House, realized that if you were in a wheelchair, you couldn't take part in any of the tours because nowhere was anything wheelchair accessible. So she had ramps installed in the East Wing and the North Portico so that everybody could participate in this. The whole point is that she wanted everyone to feel that this was their house and that they were going to be able to enjoy it. Now, saying that and opening up the accessibility didn't mean that she wasn't concerned about this being a show place when foreign dignitaries came, or even when ordinary people were coming to the White House. She wanted everyone to know that this was a grand museum to show everybody what the White House was and what the American people were capable of. So she agreed to work with the Committee for the Preservation of the White House. She said, I don't know a lot about this. You can go to the next slide. She said, I don't know a lot about this, so I have to work with experts. We have to do what we can to continue the work that Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Johnson had already started. By the time the Nixons moved into the White House, about 1/3 of the furnishings were antiques. And she said, okay, what are we going to do to be able to continue this and to be able to expand their work? So go to the next slide. So working with Clement Conyer, who was the deputy chief of protocol and the curator for the State Department, until she brought him over to work with her at the White House, they set about to try and do what they could to kind of finish, or at least really make a good showing of continuing what Mrs. Kennedy and Mrs. Johnson had begun. So they went room by room. They said, okay, what are we going to do? How are we going to kind of expand what we need? So if you go to the next slide, this is an example of one of these rooms. This was actually one of her favorite rooms. And it's interesting because you think, okay, how are they going to get what they need? How are they going to get all of this amazing silver? How are they going to get the paintings to get them to be able to show in the White House? How are they going to be able to get the furnishings? Well, they have to do that a lot through fundraising. And so one of their tricks was to bring people back to the White House for a special luncheon or tea and kind of show them what was going to happen. And often they could be very successful in this. One of her greatest triumphs, her accomplishments, if you go to the next slide, was that they would find these pieces in different places and then convince people to let them bring them back to the White House. And it might be that they bring them back and that the idea is that they were going to be on loan, but sometimes they ended up staying. Go to the next one. This is an example of the picture on the right is a painting of Louisa Adams, but it's the picture on the left, the portrait of Dolly Madison that she was very proud of. They discovered this piece in the Pennsylvania Academy of Fine Arts, and they convinced them to allow this Gilbert Stuart portrait that had hung in the White House before the British burned it down. They convinced them to let them bring that back to the White House again. And she was very proud of the fact that they were able to do that. By the time everything started to fall apart in 1974, she and Conger had added more than 500 18th and 19th century pieces of American furniture, artwork, chandeliers, and rugs to the collection. But many people didn't know that this was going on. They didn't know that she was doing this. And when people would press her and say, why don't you tell them that this is happening? She would say, go to the next slide. She would say that she did not want to be compared, in particular to Mrs. Kennedy. Remember that there had been a lot of comparisons between the two women in the 1960 race, and she didn't want any of this to come about. She didn't want to take anything away from Mrs. Kennedy, but she also felt that she could not compete with the ghosts of the Kennedys that were in the White House. And so she said, no, we'll just leave it. Don't press the issue. If you go to one last picture. So the one time that we can kind of see this interaction between the Kennedys, Nancy mentioned that Mrs. Kennedy was not ready to come back when Mrs. Johnson named the garden after her. In 1974, the Nixons invited Mrs. Kennedy and her children to come back to the White House to see her husband's portrait. And so what they did was they set up this very private showing. It was only the press was kept out of it. Nobody knew about it. It was just Jackie and the kids and the Nixon family. And Mrs. Onassis was completely overwhelmed by the gesture, by the portrait, and praised everything that Pat had done in the White House. One last slide, please. In conclusion, Pat did much to preserve the dignity and the beauty of the White House. She also made certain that more Americans would have access to see and experience it, to be able for themselves to feel that this was the people's house. Whether or not her work would have become public knowledge, we will never know, because the Watergate scandal kind of absorbed everything, and her legacy got twisted up with that of her husband's. In the end, though, she did achieve her goals and to continue the process of turning it into a showcase and allowing it for everyone else to see. And now I'm going to turn it back over to Catherine. Thank you.
Hold on. Thank you so much. I think I've been muted. Thank you so much. Thank you so much, Mary and Jody and Nancy. Those were fantastic presentations and just such powerful demonstrations of the ways in which First Ladies have led the preservation movement in really important ways, but also filled with amazing images and stories. Thank you. Thank you each so much. If you've got any questions, please drop them into the chat and I'll get them from folks who are monitoring that. But we've got a few questions to start. And I think the first one, Jody, comes to you to ask, could you talk a little bit more about why Mrs. Kennedy's background prepared her for this? What she studied, but also had she been involved in other projects like this?
Absolutely. So Jacqueline Kennedy was educated in various places, including the Sorbonne in Paris, and she had a degree in French literature from George Washington University by the time it was all over. But she was very much interested in her own historical background as a Bouvier,
Right.
and had a particular interest because she spoke fluent French in French culture and the arts. And as she and President Kennedy developed their own attitudes and sense of the cultural arts, it was based in large part upon the French model. And so she took on also her own redecoration of her own private homes and had the experience of working with people like Jane Reitzman and Bunny Mellon, both of whom tutored her in the ability to put together a knowledge of antiques and the way in which she could think through acquiring these pieces for these period rooms. And so she had quite a bit of background coming into the project that she then used her network of people who were well connected between Europe and the United States to acquire the things that were needed and to fully realize her ideas about the design. Of course, this presented some problems as well when she employed the House of Jansen from Paris and Stéphane Boudin, and we had DuPont and Boudin back and forth behind the scenes. We also had New York interior designer Sister Parrish. And so what the public didn't know was that there were all kinds of machinations going on behind the scenes between France and Americana as ways in which Mrs. Kennedy was trying to realize her plan. So that helps to see a little bit more of the context of what was going on and how she was prepared for this.
Thank you, Jody. That's fascinating. One more question for you, which is, was she nervous about the documentary?
She was nervous because Mrs. Kennedy suffered a bit from what you would call communication apprehension to start with. She was at heart a shy person and did not like public speaking or communicating in public. My colleague Nancy Keegan-Smith was talking the other day to me about how she was smoking cigarette after cigarette before the taping started. But they actually pre-taped the White House tour over a period of 3 days. And so there was a little bit of time to work out the kinks, and there was a lot of editing that was done. There are 195 edits that make up the final tape of the White House tour. And so part of the nervousness that she may have displayed in the beginning was, in a sense, dissipated over the time of the putting together of the show.
Fantastic. Thanks for that behind the scenes story, especially with the editing together. That's great. Nancy, I'd love to ask a little bit more about the art that Mrs. Johnson brought into the White House. I mean, it seems like it was so much a part of the restoration and so much a part of her, and particularly, as you said, her focus on Americana. I feel like I've even read a story about that Winslow Homer being brought into the White House in a paper bag, maybe. But I just wonder if you might talk a little bit about how she selected the pieces.
Well, I think the big and it's come across well in this program with the excellent presentations of Mary and Jody. The big thing is with Mrs. Johnson, she was terrified that Mrs. Kennedy asked her this, and Mrs. Johnson was not normally a woman to be terrified. She did not think this would be her first project. And she actually told me, she said, Nancy, I didn't know anything about 18th century, and Mrs. Kennedy did. But in between November 26, 1963, and the first meeting in March of the Committee for the Preservation of the White House, she had learned a great deal because Mrs. Johnson was extremely intelligent. And she also was very able to take something and make it hers. And she really wanted to bring, as Jody said, Jackie Kennedy veered toward the French. She even would get into issues with Henry DuPont, who wanted more American furniture, and Jackie wanted French. And so Mrs. Johnson wanted American pieces. She did the one thing I didn't mention was the White House china that she deserved was not done abroad. It was done by Tiffany's, and it featured wildflowers. And so it's probably the most American of all White House china. And she just really appreciated trying to get more Americana into the White House. And then there was this very practical side of her when she saw antique precious rugs being destroyed. And she goes, no, let's get them created and preserve the actual antique. So it doesn't totally answer your question, Jody, but
It's okay.
it somewhat does.
It's okay. Thank you. And Mary, a question for you. I mean, I'm a huge fan of your book, and of the stories it tells about Mrs. Nixon, and just the way it portrays her in ways that I think people had not considered before your book. And as you and I've discussed, I think Mrs. Nixon in many ways was a preservationist ahead of her time. She was very focused on accessibility and inclusivity in a way that, preservation today prides itself on being focused on, but it was not at that point. And she really led the way in that. You've talked about her, the sort of political reasons why she was so focused on accessibility and this being everybody's house. I just wonder, were there also things, in her own background or her own personal experiences that pushed her in that direction?
Well, one of the things that she was known for was that she answered every letter that anyone ever wrote to her. And she said that part of the reason she did this was because she came from a small town and she knew what a big deal it was to get a letter that was postmarked from Washington, D.C., much less postmarked from the White House or from the vice president or something. And so I think that sense of it's important that people be treated with respect. I think that's a big part of this, that it isn't just, I mean, I don't know that she would have thought of this as the way we think of it is in terms of accessibility. I think it was about, we have to respect these people. And these are the people who are working hard and they're not respected. She would, any event that she went to, she would stand and shake every hand of anyone who was in line. Because again, they came out to see her, she should show them the same respect. And I think that rather than seeing this as, she was recognizing in a way ahead of her time for, Americans with Disabilities Act or anything like that, I think it really comes from this basic idea of we have to respect everyone's ability and everyone's right to take a part in all of this. And I think she really did see that as one of the things that she has to, that she could contribute. And that was very important to her, that it be real.
Oh, that's such a beautiful answer, Mary. Thank you so much, and so illuminating, And it strikes me that all of these first ladies, in a way, were also about respect, right? Respect for this place, respect for the artistry of the United States, respect for its people, respect for its culture, in really beautiful ways. And I think, preservation can be such a profound way for all of us to show that respect for each other. And I certainly think that idea comes from this kind of preservation. So thanks to each of you for these wonderful presentations, and thanks so much for your illuminating scholarship on this important topic. And with that, I'll turn it back over to Nancy to close.
I would like to thank everyone for an absolutely wonderful panel. I really enjoyed it. And I think it is a tribute to the First Ladies and a tribute to our newest lifetime member, the National Trust for Historic Preservation. And Catherine, we will do your second program. So please look forward to our programming in the future. We have some things on in the pipeline, and I would like to thank everyone for joining us tonight, and have a great rest of the week.
Thanks again.